It's palpable that the anger of citizens is rising. It's been on a sort of slow simmer for years. It seems to be coming to the boil. The heat has been turned up, or the heat that's already there is somehow building in intensity. You can't point to any single place on the map really and say here's the seat of it. The building anger and frustration and heat and pain is everywhere in the West, certainly, and it's for all sorts of reasons. There are many symptoms, all coming from the same disease. By now, we've all endured, 4 years of the most dangerous and blatant assault on freedom and civil rights in the history of humankind. That's a fact. And I make no apologies for bringing this up over and over, for worrying at this like a terrier with a rat, because the sustained abuse of our species, inflicted on an unprecedented scale, even after all these years, it remains unaddressed, unconfessed, and without consequences for the guilty so far. The guilty have been so confident, blasé, that they don't even seek any longer to deny the coordinated global collusion of big state, big pharma, big media, wholesale collusion that ended completely or ruined forever uncounted millions of lives. And it is millions of lives across the West, around the world, directly or indirectly because of policies and practices that have been in place. What have we seen? Well, we've seen the destruction of trust in the state for millions of people for whom that trust in the state will likely never come back. And if it does, not in the same way. And fragile in that way that you can break a vase and glue it all back together again, but you would never trust it so that you would fill it with water and put flowers in it. It's not going to be the same again. Trust in the state, trust in science, trust in medicine or the medical fraternity, it's gone. We've seen by far and away the biggest, the most shameless transfer of wealth from the working class and the lower middle class to the wealthy, to the already wealthy, the biggest transfer of that wealth in all of history. I mean, it's nearly complete. This week, just past, I listened to an emeritus professor from the Australian National University. He's called Ramesh Thakur, and he was actually calling for the Nobel Peace Prize to be awarded to those millions who stood in the face of the tyranny and fought for their freedom and the freedom of others and their rights and the rights of others against odds that were at times all but overwhelming. The assault on personal privacy, bodily autonomy, the right to make the final decision about what happens to you and why, the attack on freedom of speech, freedom to travel, the freedom and the right to work, just to go out to work and provide for families. All of that and more was wrenched from our hands by authoritarians who revelled in their power to do it and, in large part, grew fat and fatter on the financial proceeds of their wrongdoing, divvying up the take and sharing it amongst their friends. He said Peace Prize. Speaking for myself, I want nothing whatever to do with any of those entities of the world of before. The Nobel Committee included, frankly. Nobel that has previously handed the Peace Prize to the likes of, what I call climate hoaxer Al Gore and past US President Barack Obama, who during his tenure in the White House dropped more than 20,000 bombs and was at war longer than any other US president in history. He got the Peace Prize. But I absolutely agree with that professor that the stubborn stand of the dissenters, of the defiant ones, demands recognition now and for all time. But the popular, the anger of the people is rising all around us like floodwater. It's lapping around ankles now and getting deeper. Across Europe, in the Netherlands, in Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Greece, elsewhere besides, the farmers, with the full-throated support of millions of their countrymen, are out in force protesting against efforts by their governments to achieve the wholesale destruction of that industry. For perverse reasons, the destruction of the age-old effort to feed the people. In Canada, I think a lot about Canada, the unlikeliest centre of totalitarianism that a person born and raised in the West could contemplate. In Canada, more and more people are aware of and righteously furious about what their Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his political allies are up to, what they've been up to. You know, they're still in the aftermath of the truckers' protest, much though there's an effort to have that swept under the carpet. You know, the truckers' protest that saw the Emergency Act brought down like a cudgel on the heads of those protesting the experimental gene therapies that were pushed as vaccines by Trudeau's government, as they were pushed by governments all around the world. In many places, those experimental gene therapies were mandated, but all over the place, people had to choose between having their jobs or having the jabs. And those that wouldn't take the jabs lost their jobs. And if that isn't mandated, I don't know what is. But in Canada, the Emergency Act enabled the freezing of bank accounts and the imprisonment of protesters, peaceful protesters, who were rounded up and labelled right-wing extremists, right next door to domestic terrorists, for that protest. The so-called Quds 4, that's 4 Canadian men who've been held on remand in little more than cages, without bail or due process for, at this moment, 740 days and counting. They're not alone. Canada is also the country that has made euthanasia a national industry. It's practically a national pastime. Tens of thousands of Canadian citizens already helped, let's say, through the exit door from life. And that availability of euthanasia is nudging closer and closer to those who just feel a bit sad. If you're suffering from depression, you might be offered the needle to put you out your misery, rather than the help and compassion that might let you get back to a normal life. In the United States of America, in advance of the 2020 election, the government conspired with big tech to censor tens of millions of online posts by people questioning the legitimacy and safety of the mail-in ballot system, the system that disproportionately benefited Joe Biden, helping him into the White House. And the same conspiratorial blob worked to push the lie of Russiagate and to disappear the truth of the Hunter Biden laptop. If that's not interfering with an election, again, I don't know what is. The US has no functioning southern border, so that millions of illegal migrants flood day and night into towns and cities of the nation, forever altering the demographics and so likely altering the voting patterns of one state after another. I mean, there are voices growing louder and louder in states in the United States of America talking about seceding from the Union. You know, talk that there hasn't been since the last American Civil War. And there's dark talk of another one coming. And, you know, it's a year of upcoming elections in America and across Europe. Populist parties are on the rise and frightening the bejesus out of the authoritarian incumbents that can see them coming and know what the consequences will be if they have the kind of success that's being predicted for those so-called populist parties, those extremist right-wing parties. That's the pendulum swinging back. And the further it swung the one way, the further it'll have to swing back. And in the US, maverick Republican Donald Trump is still the front runner by a country mile for that nation's next election. Whatever you happen to think of him, love him or loathe him or, have no particular opinion, whatever. But there's anger everywhere. There's outrage, building determination to push back against a coordinated global conspiracy seeking domination of the world by a handful of ideologues hell-bent on a return to feudalism. Everything for the few wealthy and scraps and crumbs for the billions of the rest. I mean, these people are hell-bent on taking and keeping control of the holy trinity of power, which is energy, money and food. And now, we get the sense that those inflicting the misery, or those that would say they were only obeying orders, or those that stood and stand mutely and impotently by while the dirty work keeps going on, the denial, the refusal to acknowledge the excess deaths all around the world in the aftermath of the rollout of the gene therapies. All of those people are evidently feeling the heat now. They're finding it harder and harder to avoid hearing, if not listening to, the voices building to fury. In Westminster, in London, capital of the UK, last week, or just a little bit further back, home of the Uniparty, the unholy alliance of Conservative, Labour and Liberal, His Majesty's so-called opposition, the so-called Labour Party, leant on the Speaker of the House, some might call it bullying, to enable Labour MPs to wriggle free of calling for a straightforward ceasefire in Gaza of the genocide. And in the world beyond Westminster, people are angry and getting angrier. And apparently, those who largely cheered on the decisions that ended or destroyed uncounted lives, decisions that made lives unbearable, well, they're hearing noises now they don't like. Hurty words. This week it was announced that an additional £31 million is to be spent on increased security and protection for MPs. This, after all the lives, other people's lives, ended or destroyed during and by the COVID years. Destruction of life and freedom that the vast majority of MPs linked arms to dismiss as unavoidable consequences of fighting the so-called pandemic. Life has been made intolerable for millions already, and elected officials here and abroad did nothing, cared nothing about all that suffering. And they're still stoking the fear, still stoking and supporting the war in Ukraine that has already claimed 600,000 lives there. Most recently, we've had to listen to the stoking of the threat of world war and of the need to recruit our sons and daughters into a citizen army, perhaps to fight that war. Always in the background, too, is the assault on our lives in the name of saving the planet, the climate hoax that has inspired the global suicide note called Net Zero. In the name of saving the planet, the self-proclaimed elite empower themselves to herd us into 15-minute ghettos, to take away cars and other vehicles that actually work and replace them with electric vehicles that are no more and no less than cover for ending private car ownership once and for all. And part of the push too are the population control mechanisms in the form of central bank digital currencies and associated social credit scores, all that madness. I ask in all seriousness, what did they think would happen if they kept turning the screws on people? You smother someone, you restrict their breathing, and before the end, that person will struggle, who lash out. And who could blame them? And the trouble hasn't just been in the past 3 or 4 years. It's got worse and more obvious, of course, but it's been building for much longer. Up and down the country and all around the world, communities have been meddled with or destroyed, populations treated with contempt, the locals made second-class citizens where they live, second class or less, in the face of unprecedented, unasked-for change. And everyone's pawns in that movement. The millions are on the move around the world, and they've been set moving by those same elites meddling with lives everywhere. All the way back at the end of the last millennium, in the late 1990s, past British Prime Minister Tony Blair's avowed intentions to see to it that the people of Britain would have their noses rubbed in diversity. And so they have had. And the screws have been slowly tightening for years, only leaping into overdrive in the aftermath of Brexit and the election in the States of Donald Trump. Two unexpected and unplanned for events that apparently triggered the sustained punishment beating we've had inflicted on us ever since. And now, all around the world, for all sorts of justified and understandable reasons, manifesting in all manner of ways, the people's anger is finally rising to the surface. And why is anyone surprised? Why, in all seriousness, are those in positions of power surprised at the anger? You don't get to end lives, ruin lives, compromise and throttle lives. You don't get to replace one way of life with another without the possibility of protest from whomever was living that life. You don't get to dismantle and destroy cultures, heritages, civilization without pushback from some of those citizens. You don't get to shape the world, reshape the world in your own image, to your advantage, to the advantage of a tiny minority, to the detriment of the hundreds of millions, indeed the billions, and then play the victim when someone somewhere says enough. A person cornered, a person left with nothing, or who feels he has nothing left to lose, is finally free in a fundamental sense, free to act in any way that suits. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a storm coming, and those who bloody-mindedly sowed the seeds of the whirlwind, who reaped the benefits of so doing for so long, are finally feeling the change in the wind.